Let me begin with what we are witnessing right now in the Caribbean, because this isn't just another geopolitical crisis. This is a fundamental restructuring of global economic power playing out in real time with warships, missiles, and oil tankers. And the implications for markets, for energy security, for the dollar itself, they're profound. Picture this. As of late October, the United States has positioned roughly 10,000 troops in the Caribbean, 3 guided missile destroyers, an attack submarine, the USS Iwo Jima carrying over 4,500 Marines, and the supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford. This is not a routine deployment. This is the largest military buildup the region has seen in decades, and it's all focused on one country, Venezuela. Now, why does this matter economically? Because Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran. We're talking about roughly 300 billion barrels of crude oil. But here's the catch. It's heavy, sour crude, the kind that requires specialized refining, the kind that Gulf Coast refineries in the United States were literally built to process. You can't just substitute it easily with light, tight oil from Texas shale fields. And that's where our story really begins. Because what we're seeing is not just a military standoff. It's an economic war with 3 major players, the United States, Russia, and China, each making calculated moves on a chessboard where oil is the ultimate prize. Let me walk you through the American strategy first. In March of this year, President Trump imposed a 25% tariff on all goods from any country that imports Venezuelan oil. Think about that for a moment. That's not a sanction on Venezuela directly, that's a sanction on Venezuela's customers. It's economic coercion at a global scale. India, which had been buying Venezuelan crude, suddenly faces a choice: continue trading with Caracas and lose access to American markets, or comply and find oil elsewhere. Then on May 27th, the administration went further. Chevron and other American energy companies were ordered to cease all operations in Venezuela. Now, this is significant because under Chevron's management, Venezuelan oil production had actually been recovering. We saw an increase of almost 200,000 barrels per day between 2022 and 2024, bringing total output to around 900,000 barrels per day by the first quarter of this year. Chevron wasn't just extracting oil, they were maintaining infrastructure, training personnel, importing parts and equipment. When they pulled out, they took that operational expertise with them, and predictably, Venezuelan production collapsed. By April, we're seeing output fall to 700,000 barrels per day, the lowest in nearly a year. A 20% drop in exports in just the second quarter alone. Venezuela's National Assembly declared a state of economic emergency in April. Inflation, which had somewhat stabilized in previous years, is now projected to hit nearly 200% for 2025. The bolivar is in free fall. Basic goods are scarce. This is economic warfare, and it's devastatingly effective. But here's where it gets interesting, because Venezuela didn't just collapse. They pivoted hard. Enter China. Beijing has been waiting for precisely this moment. As American companies withdrew, Chinese firms moved in aggressively. Anhui Guangda Mining and China Concord Resources signed contracts with PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, targeting combined production of 251,000 barrels per day. They're committing $7.7 billion in investments. Chinese companies are installing new offshore platforms in Lake Maracaibo. They're not just buying Venezuelan oil, they're becoming partners in production. And the numbers are staggering. Today, approximately 85 to 90% of Venezuelan oil exports go to China. Let me repeat that. 9 out of every 10 barrels leaving Venezuela end up in Chinese refineries. Beijing has essentially replaced American companies as Venezuela's primary energy partner. Since 2007, China has poured about $67 billion into Venezuela, making it Caracas's most important creditor. This isn't charity. This is strategic resource acquisition. China is securing long-term energy supplies at a time when they're trying to reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil that must transit through the vulnerable Strait of Hormuz. They're paying for Venezuelan crude in yuan, not dollars. They're providing financing that bypasses Western banking systems. This is de-dollarization in action. Now, let's talk about Russia, because Moscow's role is equally calculated and it's primarily military rather than economic. But don't mistake that for being less important. Military hardware is Russia's currency of influence. Between 2001 and 2014, Russian arms exports to Venezuela totaled approximately $14.5 billion. Sukhoi Su, 30 fighters, attack helicopters, tanks, advanced air defense systems like the S-300VM. This wasn't just weapon sales. This was building interoperability, creating dependence on Russian maintenance and spare parts, training Venezuelan officers in Russian military doctrine. And this year, in 2025, Russia and Venezuela formalized a strategic partnership and cooperation treaty covering defense, energy, and technology. Both legislatures ratified it. This is a formal alliance. What does this mean on the ground? Venezuelan forces are conducting military exercises with over 2,500 troops. They are displaying Russian-made Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets equipped with Kh-31 anti-ship missiles. These are specifically designed to target warships. They've deployed Russian Buk M2E air defense systems near Caracas, capable of intercepting fighter jets, drones, cruise missiles, and guided bombs. Russian transport aircraft, Il-76 seconds linked to the former Wagner Group, have been landing in Caracas, carrying additional air defense systems, including Buk and Pantsir-S-1 platforms. And here's the escalation. A Russian lawmaker publicly stated that Moscow could supply Venezuela with advanced Oreshnik and Caliber missiles. These are cruise missiles with ranges that could threaten American naval assets operating in the Caribbean. Now, from an economic perspective, you might ask, why does Russia care about Venezuela? They're not major trading partners. Venezuelan oil doesn't directly benefit Russia's economy. But think about it differently. Every barrel Venezuela sells to China is a barrel that doesn't come from the Gulf, that doesn't strengthen ties between Beijing and American-aligned producers. Russia is playing the long game of undermining American influence in what Washington has considered its backyard for over a century. Moreover, keeping Venezuela in play as a disruptive force ties down American military and diplomatic resources. It creates another front, another pressure point. In the great power competition between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, Venezuela is a pawn that Russia can move at relatively low cost with high strategic value. Let me now shift to what this means for global markets, because the ripple effects are already being felt. First, oil prices. Analysts are warning that any American military action against Venezuela, and we have to consider this possibility given the troop deployment, could spike Brent crude prices significantly. Venezuela's heavy, sour crude is crucial for specialized Gulf Coast refineries that were built specifically to process this type of oil. You cannot easily substitute it with light, tight oil from American shale. If Venezuelan exports are disrupted further, either through conflict or intensified sanctions, those refineries face feedstock shortages. Diesel costs would increase. Remember, Diesel is the fuel of commerce. It moves trucks, trains, ships, agricultural equipment. Rising diesel prices mean rising costs throughout the supply chain, which means inflation. European and Asian buyers who've been purchasing diesel refined from Venezuelan crude would need to find alternatives, tightening global diesel markets even further. We could see price shocks similar to what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine, when energy markets went haywire. Second, let's talk about the dollar. This is perhaps the most significant long-term implication. For decades, oil has been priced and traded predominantly in US dollars. This creates automatic demand for dollars globally, which helps maintain its reserve currency status and allows America to run persistent trade deficits without the same consequences other countries would face. But China is paying for Venezuelan oil in yuan. Russia conducts energy trades in rubles and yuan. Iran, which has also moved closer to both Moscow and Beijing, is increasingly settling oil sales in currencies other than dollars. What we're witnessing is the gradual construction of an alternative financial architecture. Now, the dollar isn't going to collapse tomorrow. It remains the world's dominant reserve currency, backed by the deepest and most liquid financial markets on earth, by American military power, by institutional trust built over decades. But margins matter. If 10%, then 15%, then 20% of global oil trade shifts away from dollar settlement, that's a meaningful erosion. And it's not just oil. China's Belt and Road Initiative is financing infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Latin America with loans denominated in yuan. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanding to include others, are discussing creating their own settlement currency for trade among members. Digital currencies and central bank digital currencies are creating new mechanisms for international payment that bypass SWIFT and the dollar-based banking system. Venezuela is a microcosm of this broader shift, a country with massive natural resources facing American pressure, turning to alternative partners who offer financing and security outside Western-dominated institutions. It's a playbook that other nations are watching carefully. Third, let's consider the impact on American hemispheric influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is fundamentally within America's sphere of influence, has been a cornerstone of US foreign policy since 1823. What we're seeing now is the most significant challenge to that doctrine in modern history. Russian military aircraft are operating from Venezuelan bases. Chinese companies are controlling critical infrastructure in the Panama Canal through port operations. Both Moscow and Beijing are providing economic and military support that directly challenges American regional dominance. This has implications beyond Venezuela. Countries across Latin America are taking note. If Venezuela can successfully resist American pressure by aligning with China and Russia, what stops others from doing the same? Brazil, with its massive economy and natural resources, has already been charting a more independent course. Argentina's economy has been in perpetual crisis, making it potentially receptive to Chinese investment. Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia all have governments that have shown willingness to work with Beijing and Moscow. The economic implication is that American companies may find themselves increasingly competing with Chinese state-backed firms that can offer financing terms no private company could match, backed by political support from Beijing. This isn't just about Venezuela's oil. It's about access to lithium in Chile, copper in Peru, agricultural products from Brazil, rare earth elements across the region. Now, let me address the military expenditure dimension, because this deployment isn't cheap. Maintaining a carrier strike group costs approximately $6 to $7 million per day when you add destroyers, submarines, amphibious assault ships, and over 10,000 personnel, we're easily talking about $15 to $20 million daily in direct operational costs. Over months, this becomes billions. And for what economic return? If the objective is to pressure Venezuela into regime change, the track record of such interventions is mixed at best. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya all cost trillions of dollars and produced questionable strategic outcomes. American taxpayers are funding a military operation that may not achieve its stated goals while simultaneously pushing Venezuela deeper into the arms of America's strategic competitors. There's an opportunity cost here that's rarely discussed. Those billions spent on military operations in the Caribbean are billions not invested in domestic infrastructure, in renewable energy development, in education and technology that might actually enhance American economic competitiveness against China in the long term. Let me talk about the humanitarian and migration dimension, because this has direct economic consequences for the United States. Venezuela's economic collapse has already produced one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2014. That's roughly a quarter of the entire population. If this military standoff escalates into actual conflict, or if sanctions drive Venezuela into even deeper economic chaos, that migration flow will intensify. Where do those refugees go? Colombia is already hosting over 2 million. Brazil, Ecuador, Peru have absorbed hundreds of thousands each, but many are making their way north toward the United States. This creates political pressure inside the US over immigration, strains social services in border states, and generates downstream economic costs. There's a cruel irony here. American policy designed to punish the Venezuelan government ends up creating humanitarian emergencies that America then has to manage. Now let's discuss the energy security paradox. The United States is currently the world's largest oil producer, pumping around 13 million barrels per day. We achieved energy independence, at least in crude terms, several years ago. So why does Venezuelan oil matter? Because energy markets are global and price is set at a margin. If Venezuelan barrels disappear from global supply, prices rise everywhere, including in America. American consumers pay more at the pump. American refineries that specialized in processing Venezuelan heavy crude have to retool or find alternative suppliers, which is expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, if the US wants to maintain leverage over global oil prices, particularly to keep them low enough to hurt Russia's petroeconomy, but high enough that American shale producers remain profitable, having Venezuelan production of the market removes one of the few swing sources that could add supply quickly if needed. There's a strategic tension here. On one hand, removing Venezuelan oil from global markets hurts the Maduro government. On the other hand, it removes flexibility from global supply, potentially benefits Russia by keeping prices elevated, and hands market share to China. The economic strategy cuts both ways. Let me address what this means for the future of energy markets more broadly. We're supposed to be in an energy transition, moving toward renewables to address climate change. But what we're seeing is intensifying competition over fossil fuel resources. China is locking in long-term oil supply agreements with Venezuela, with Iran, with Russia, with African producers. They're securing hydrocarbon feedstocks not just for energy, but for petrochemicals, plastics, synthetic materials that will be needed regardless of how many electric vehicles are on the road. Meanwhile, Western countries have been underinvesting in oil and gas development due to ESG pressures and climate commitments. But demand hasn't fallen commensurately. The result is tighter markets and higher prices, which ironically makes fossil fuel production more profitable and renewable alternatives less competitive on price. The Venezuela situation highlights this contradiction. We're deploying massive military resources to influence control over oil reserves. At the same time, we're supposedly transitioning away from oil dependence. The realpolitik of energy security is overwhelming the rhetoric of energy transition. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because there are several possible scenarios, each with different economic implications. Scenario one, continued standoff. The US maintains its military presence. Sanctions remain in place. Venezuela continues operating with Chinese and Russian support. In this scenario, we see persistent upward pressure on oil prices, continued de-dollarization in energy markets, gradual erosion of American influence in Latin America, and ongoing refugee flows. This is actually the most likely scenario in the near term, and it's a slow burn that disadvantages the US economically while strengthening ties between Beijing, Moscow, and Caracas. Scenario two, military escalation. If shooting actually starts, if American forces attempt to blockade Venezuelan ports or conduct strikes on military installations, all bets are off. Oil prices would spike immediately. We could see Brent crude jump to $120, $130 per barrel or higher. Global equity markets would tumble on war risk. Russia might respond by escalating elsewhere, perhaps in Ukraine or the Baltics. China would likely respond economically, perhaps dumping treasury holdings or restricting rare earth exports. The economic damage would be substantial and global. Scenario three, negotiated settlement. This seems least likely given current postures, but imagine a scenario where the US, perhaps under a different administration, seeks a diplomatic off-ramp. Sanctions are eased in exchange for Venezuelan political reforms or elections. American companies are allowed to return. Venezuelan production ramps back up, bringing prices down and undercutting Russia's oil revenues. China's position weakens as Venezuela diversifies its partnerships. This would be the economically optimal outcome, but requires political will that doesn't currently exist. Scenario four, internal collapse. Venezuelan government stability finally breaks under economic pressure. Maduro falls, there's a transition government, and the US moves in to support it economically and politically. Venezuela's oil sector opens up to American and European investment again. But this scenario carries its own risks: post-collapse chaos, potential civil conflict, massive reconstruction costs, and no guarantee that whatever comes next is stable or friendly to American interests. Libya, after Gaddafi, is a cautionary tale. Each of these scenarios has been priced into markets to varying degrees. Oil futures reflect some risk premium for potential supply disruption. Defense contractors have seen stock prices rise on the prospect of increased military spending. Emerging market debt is repricing based on perceptions of American willingness to enforce its hemispheric influence. Currency traders are watching to see if this accelerates de-dollarization trends. What's not fully priced in, I would argue, is the long-term structural shift in global economic power that this represents. Investors are still thinking in terms of temporary disruption rather than permanent realignment. They're betting that American dominance will reassert itself, that China and Russia are overextending, that Venezuela will eventually come back into the Western orbit. I'm not convinced that's the right bet. What I see is a country with enormous natural resources, successfully resisting the world's largest military and economic power by leveraging relationships with its strategic competitors. I see China systematically building alternative infrastructure for trade and finance that bypasses American-controlled systems. I see Russia willing to provide military capabilities to any country that challenges American interests, effectively forcing Washington to spread its attention and resources across multiple theaters. The economic world order that emerged after World War II, Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, dollar dominance, American security guarantees in exchange for economic access, that order is fracturing. Venezuela is not causing that fracture, but is a clear symptom of it. Investors, for businesses, for policymakers, the question becomes, how do you operate in a world that's increasingly multipolar? where supply chains span multiple spheres of influence, where currency risk is rising, where sanctions and counter-sanctions are routine tools of statecraft. Companies need to think about redundancy in their supply chains, about exposure to different regulatory regimes, about currency hedging strategies. Investors need to consider geopolitical risk as a permanent feature of portfolios rather than a temporary aberration. Policymakers need to recognize that military force and economic sanctions have limits when adversaries can offer alternative partnerships. The Venezuelan situation is teaching us that control of natural resources matters more than we thought in this new era of great power competition. That military overmatch doesn't necessarily translate into economic compliance. That countries facing American pressure have more options today than they did even a decade ago. What we're witnessing in the Caribbean is not just a regional crisis. It's the future of global economics playing out in compressed form. A future where power is more distributed, where the dollar is one currency among several important ones, where military and economic tools are used more aggressively by multiple powers, where smaller countries can play larger powers against each other. And from an economic standpoint, this is almost certainly going to mean higher volatility, higher risk premiums, more expensive capital, more fragmented markets. It means businesses will pay more for insurance, for hedging, for maintaining diverse supplier networks. It means investors will demand higher returns to compensate for increased geopolitical uncertainty. The era of stable, predictable globalization that we experienced from roughly 1990 to 2015, that's over. We're in something different now, something more contested, more dangerous, potentially less prosperous, because economic efficiency is being sacrificed for strategic security. Venezuela is showing us what that new world looks like. And whether this particular crisis ends in war, in negotiation, or in stalemate, the underlying dynamics aren't going away. We're going to see more situations like this in more places with higher stakes. That's what makes this moment so critical to understand, not just as a military confrontation or a political crisis, but as an economic inflection point that will shape markets and trade and currency values for years to come.